Well, hey there, welcome back. So we are in the story of Paul's imprisonment. How did he get to Rome, and particularly what was the charge that had him under house arrest while he was in Rome? So we've been looking at that story over the last few weeks, probably got at least 2 more weeks of the story to go. But where we've got to so far is that Paul has been arrested in Jerusalem for supposedly starting a riot and being an insurrectionist and all these things. But in reality, he was just minding his own business. It was actually a couple of Jewish pilgrims from Ephesus, where Paul had just been, that had actually stirred up the riot in the first place. But nevertheless, he's been arrested. He's been, well, first of all, rescued from a mob riot, and that was intended on killing him, and then brought into the barracks in Jerusalem to be initially interrogated by the tribune of the cohort, who's the representative of the governor. And so Claudius Lysias, we've already met him, and what his role was is to simply figure out what on earth is going on. What is this guy being beaten for, or what is all the commotion about? What has this guy actually done? And to figure out what it is that he's being charged for, so that he can then send Paul to the governor to then be tried properly. And that's his whole role. Lysias's job is not to actually try Paul for whatever the crimes are. It's to simply just to have some sort of crime against him, to figure out what it is that he's done wrong. In the same way that the police force it's not their job to put a person on trial, it's the job to arrest and to figure out what the crime is and to actually bring charges against this particular person. So that's what his role has been, and what he's figured out is basically nothing. He's tried to, he's let Paul speak to the Jewish audience to try to, hopefully appease them and make it all go away. That just started another riot. So then he sent him down to the Sanhedrin, whose job is to hold court for the Jewish people, and a lot of authority is given to the Sanhedrin to deal with these matters. And all that's done is broken out in another riot. Wherever he goes, Paul seems to be starting riots. At the very least, but he seems to be causing people to be very, very upset at whatever he seems to be saying. And the whole time, Lysias has no idea what Paul's saying, because he's always speaking in Aramaic. He'll speak to Lysias in Greek, but for when he's speaking to the Jewish people, he's going to be speaking in Aramaic. So Lysias has got no idea what's going on. All he hears is Paul saying blah, 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 blah in a foreign language, and then everybody gets angry. So he's got no idea what's going on. So he's tried to interrogate him and was about to flog him, and then that's when he made his biggest mistake. He was about to flog a Roman citizen in Paul, and Paul has waited for the very last second, when he's been stripped naked, he's been chained to a post, he's about to be flogged. Then he turns around with the big reveal. Hey, by the way, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen? I'm pretty sure that's not something you guys are allowed to do. And really played up the situation very well, which has put Lysias on his side. He's now got Lysias exactly where he wants him. Lysias has, in fact, committed a crime now, even stripping Paul naked without trial, and was about with the intention to flog him, which probably would have led to Paul's death. That's got him in a terrible situation. And so now he's very much working in Paul's favor, doing his very best to get Paul out of this circumstance, because if Paul goes down, he brings Lysias down with him. And so Lysias knows that he's going to do everything he can to show Paul that he's very much on his side, and will try to get him out of this as best as possible. So that's where we find ourselves in the story, and Paul has just been sent up to the governor for what will be his eventual trial. The governor is the one who holds jurisdiction over the area, and especially when it comes to Roman citizens. Paul is a Roman citizen, and so naturally should have trial in a Roman court. That's one of his prerogatives of being a Roman citizen. And so he's been sent up to the governor, if only because if he stays in Jerusalem, someone's going to kill him. So Lysias has to get him out of the city, and he needs to send him up to his boss, to his higher authority, which in this case is the governor Felix. Now, before we continue our story, it's probably worth taking a couple of minutes to explain who these governors are. What is their role? So the governor, they are Rome's representative amongst the provinces. The Roman Empire, by the time of Paul, has spread right around the Mediterranean. It covers really from Britain all the way down into modern day Iran. It spreads. It's a massive, massive empire, the biggest empire that the world had seen to that point, and it was effectively been run out of Rome by the emperor, but it was being run on the ground by his representatives who were the governors. Now, the role of the governor actually goes all the way back to the early days of Rome. Rome began as a city. Rome was just the city of Rome, like literally where modern day Rome still is. And that's all it was. It was just a city. So Rome itself wasn't a country. It wasn't an empire. It was just one of many cities on the Italian peninsula. But as it rose and became more and more powerful, and as it expanded its influence, eventually it got to a point where it was ruling not just on the Italian peninsula, but actually overseas, beginning in North Africa, in Carthage, and then out into Spain, and then further off into Greece, and then over into what was Asia Minor, what is modern day Turkey. As the empire expanded, it couldn't be effectively run from the center of Rome, just by virtue of the fact that communication is so slow. You can't deal with matters on the ground when you're literally on the other side of the Mediterranean. So that's not functional. So what the Romans would do early on is they started to send out representatives. They started to send out what we call proconsuls. So the way that the early Roman Republic was run was that you'd have a Senate, which is a group of about 100 men, and every year 2 would be appointed to be consuls. They were the highest office you could have within the Roman political structure. And they would hold that position for 12 months. And what their role was to simply run Rome, just to look after the Roman Empire, and as it expanded, to look after the expansion of this Roman world. So these 2 proconsuls, they had the highest office for that year, and after a year, they'd have to step down. And this is one of the ways that Rome kept control, or it prevented the rise of a monarchy. They got rid of their kings. They didn't want to have a king anymore. And one of the ways to circumvent that was to have 2 consuls, not just one, but 2 consuls looking after Rome just for a 1-year period. So even if they were both terrible, they're going to be gone after a year. So that was the way that they sort of structured their political system. And it was just the best way to prevent monarchy, tyranny from arising. But again, as the empire expanded, what you need are people to be able to go out and function as governors, to look after these regions. Now, that's a pretty prestigious position. You are not just a representative of Rome, but your job is to maintain the empire. And as I said this 100 times, there's only 2 rules in empire: keep the peace, pay the taxes. And that's your job. Your job is to keep the peace and pay the taxes. But along with that, assuming you're corrupt, which all of them are going to be, that's a great opportunity to make money. That's a really great opportunity to get very, very rich in the couple of years that you're functioning as the governor. And there's different ways, of course, that you can do that. The fact that you are Rome's representative and you have access to the seat of power, you're going to get a lot of people who want that influence. They want you to be able to speak on their behalf and to, do you favors with Rome. And so that's going to come at a cost. And so these governors can very much enrich themselves on bribes and favors from the elites within the areas that they're ruling. But one of the chief ways that you make money out of being a governor is through the taxes. The way that the tax system works in Rome is that every 6 years, you take a census of the whole empire. How many people are in the empire? And not just generally people, but how many working or military age men are within the empire, and how much land, how many landowners, and potentially how much revenue can be taken from the lands of the empire. So you don't have a system of income tax, for example, where you pay you pay a bit of tax to the government every time you get paid. You only get charged a land tax. If you own land, then you're going to pay tax on that, and you're going to pay it with whatever the provision is that you provide, whatever food you grow or whatever it is that you provide. That's going to be your income, but you're going to use some of that to pay the taxes to the Romans for the privilege of having that land. So you'll calculate how much each region would owe in taxes. And we see an example of this where Joseph and Mary are going down to Bethlehem because there was a census being taken. So you go back to your homeland and then you enroll yourself in the census so that the Romans have an idea of how many they've got. Anyway, the way that would work then is the Romans will say, okay, this particular region owes X amount of tax for this particular period. So that's how much they're going to owe. And over the next 6 years, it's the duty then of that province to pay their taxes, but someone needs to collect that. And so the way that that's going to work, the Romans need to have tax collectors to do their work for them, but Rome's not going to send out a whole lot of bureaucrats. They're not just going to send out armies of people from the city, from the city of Rome to do all of this work. What they're going to do instead is get the locals to do the tax collecting. Now, the most efficient way to do this is to actually auction off the taxes. So if you say to this particular region owes 1,000,000 sesterces, for example, for this particular period, and so you'll say to all of the elites, all of the wealthy people, say, okay, you guys owe 1,000,000 sesterces. Who wants the job? And so people would start to bid for the taxes. So then someone will say, well, I'll give you the 1,000,000. Someone else will say, well, I'll give you 1.1 or then 1.2. And it would be an auction. You would actually auction off the opportunity to collect the taxes. And so then what would happen would be that the governor would collect the taxes up front and they would take the 1,000,000 that's owed, send that back to Rome, and they'd keep the profits. But then it was up to the tax collectors to go out and get their money back, but then some on top of that. So this was an opportunity for them to make money as well. So there's different ways that the governors are going to enrich themselves. So it's a very prestigious position. You don't just give this to anybody. You're going to give this to your top people. Now, the way what that means then is that if you've been a consul in Rome, you've done your job, you've done your year's service as a consul, you then have the opportunity to go out and be a governor. Now, they do it by lot. You basically literally have to draw a province out of a bucket, and that's the one you get. So everyone who's been functioning as consuls gets to the opportunity to become a governor somewhere. And so then whatever you've been allotted, that's where you're going to be doing your governing for the next couple of years. But these are, again, prestigious. These are coveted positions because to have got to consul in the first place, you've had to spend a lot of money. You had to climb the ranks of the Roman political structure. That's come at a huge cost. You've paid a lot of bribes. You've paid for a lot of campaigns. You've just basically paid off all of your friends to get that position because of the honor that comes along with that. But now you've got to make your money back. And how are you going to do that? Well, you're hopefully going to become the governor of a place like Macedonia, for example, which is a very wealthy region, or the governor eventually of somewhere like Egypt, which is another wealthy region. And what that means then is you're going to be able to get your money back through taxes and through bribes and through all of the other things that come along with being a governor. So that's the job of the governor. That's how we find our governors, but especially that's what the role of the governor is. They are Rome's representative, and their job is to maintain the Romanness of the region, keep the peace, pay the taxes. That's what the job is. So that's how it had always functioned. And so only the highest status, the most elite men of Rome would ever have the opportunity to hold these positions. But things change in the empire. Once you come into a Roman empire, it's a different world in which you've got an emperor who's very paranoid. So it used to be that you become the consul, and then by default of being consul, because you're the highest person in Rome, you then get to go off and be the governor. But now that the emperor is in control, the Senate, who used to be the power, they don't have the power anymore. All of that has gone to the emperor. He controls all the power that they used to have. And so now he can appoint governors as favors. If you want to be the governor of a region, what are you going to do for me? Or if you want to hold a position in the Senate, or if you want to be consul, what are you going to do for me? Whereas it used to be based on election, and in some senses it used to be based on merit, now it's based on favor. So if you want the highest positions, you've got to be friend to the emperor. You've got to give him some sort of benefit that is going to be reciprocated back to you with these high positions. And so what that means then is that the governors are going to be appointed out of bribes or out of just reciprocated favors. You can have these opportunities now. But along with that, we get this new situation where the senators are also working hard to undermine the emperor. They don't like the emperor because the emperor's taking their power. The emperor's taken all of the opportunities that their grandfathers used to have, which was, they were the ones in control. Now they don't have any power anymore. They're really just a toothless organization. The emperor has all of that. And so they're going to always be working to undermine and hopefully to get rid of the emperor. Go back to the old republic, go back to the way when we used to have the power, not this new situation where all of the power has been held by one man. So the emperor doesn't trust the Senate. He doesn't trust these people who would normally have these positions by virtue of their great status. And so what he's going to do instead is appoint not just his friends, but people who maybe were his closest confidants or people that he trusts more than anybody else. And who do you trust more than your slaves and your ex-slaves? Now, the thing about these political positions, to hold any political office, you cannot have been a slave. The only people who are eligible for a political office in Rome are free-born Roman men. That's it. You can't be a woman. You can't be anything other than free-born, meaning that you can never have been a slave. So typically what happens if you're a slave, at some point along the way, you're going to be set free. That's one of the things that tends to happen to Roman slaves. Eventually, they're going to be set free. If they don't die along the way, they're generally going to be set free at some point, and they become what's known as a freedman. They were a slave, now they're a freed person. Not free-born, they're a freedman. And that's fine. That's great. It gives them freedom. It also gives them Roman citizenship, but they've always got the stigma of having been a slave. So they can never hold political office. Now their kids can because their kids are free-born, but they themselves can never hold that office. And that's always been the case right throughout throughout the whole Roman Empire. But what starts to happen under the emperors is that you've got these freedmen who are starting to hold these political offices, or even to the extent that some of the slaves of the imperial house are getting not necessarily political positions, but administrative positions that would typically go to senators. People that would typically of higher status would have these important managerial positions. The emperor doesn't trust the Senate anymore, so he's instead giving them these positions to his slaves because he knows he can trust his slaves because they're obviously his slaves, and that's naturally they're the ones that he's going to be wanting to use. And so what we start to see then are situations where where the rules have been broken, where freedmen are starting to become governors. And case in point is this guy, Governor Felix. Felix is a slave's name. Felix is a title. Felix means lucky or happy. So think about where we get, names like Felicity. It means luck. It means happiness. It means joy. So it has this sense of, well, in the case of a slave, complete irony, because that's exactly what you're not. You're not lucky. You're not happy. You're a slave. But we're going to call you that because, well, it's just ironic. When you get a slave, they don't get a proper name. They get a title. They get some sort of nickname based on what their task might be, or, just some sort of name like Felix. So anyway, all that to say, Governor Felix is an ex-slave, and he would have become the governor. He would have been the ex-slave of probably Claudius, would have been the former slave that he was under. And so now he's a freedman, and now he has this opportunity to become a governor. So we can see, in a sense, what that sort of suggests for us is that the governor we're dealing with here isn't this high-status, sophisticated, educated guy. It's an ex-slave. It's somebody who is just purely there out of total obligation to his former master. He's just there to do a job. He hasn't earned that position necessarily, and he's certainly not the sort of sophisticated, high-class, educated, articulate person that you would normally have in that position. He's much more common, low status, you insert the sort of derogative term that you would have there. But this is the sort of guy that we're dealing with, and we see some of these characteristics coming through in Luke's account of him. So that's something of, this is the new character in the story, and this guy's going to be driving the story now for the rest of, certainly this episode, maybe to next week as well, as one of the key characters, and really Paul's fate is in this guy's hand. Whatever is about to happen to Paul is all going to be determined by this Felix, who is, well, not necessarily of the best qualities, who's going to be very pragmatic in the way that he's dealing with this. Whatever's going to be to the best of his abilities, or what's going to benefit him the most, is the sort of person that we're going to be dealing with here. So Lysias has sent this letter, and we finished off last time looking at this letter, and it's a very interesting shift in the narrative to what to the events that actually took place. And so Claudius Lysias says to his Excellency Governor Felix, "Greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered that his accusers to present to you their case against him." Now, we saw this last time, just by way of recap. This is a really interesting shift in the narrative, a change in the way in the events as they're being told. Paul was being beaten by a crowd, and the Romans certainly came and rescued him, but then Paul intentionally did not reveal his Roman citizenship for all the reasons we've already talked about until the very last second, at which point he used it against his Roman captors to point out the crime that they had committed and were certainly about to commit. And so that's how the story actually unfolded, which was obviously going to be very detrimental to Lysias in his position if it was to ever get out that he was about to flog a Roman citizen. So he changes that part of the story. So in sending Paul up to the governor, he's saying, I found out that he's a Roman citizen, so I went down and rescued him. So I'm the hero of the story, really trying to portray himself as being, the very opposite of what he in fact was. And really what we can see here is this Lysias, doing his very, very best to show Paul, hey man, I'm on your side. I'm doing everything I can. Please remember this when you're recounting the story to my boss. So please just note that I'm doing everything I can to help you out of this situation. And so then he sends this letter off, and hoping that all of this will go away. At the very least, he's got Paul out of Jerusalem. Hopefully, Felix will be able to read the letter and go, hey, you know what? There's nothing in this. Paul, go on your way, and all of this will blow over. That's, I imagine, what Lysias is hoping will happen at this point. At the very least, that Paul won't dob him in. So anyway, that's where that story has been left off. And so now we pick it up in Caesarea. Now, Caesarea is the capital of the region of Judea. It's not Jerusalem, it's Caesarea. And Caesarea, the city itself, had been built by Herod the Great. It had been built by the first king of the Jews, at least in this new era, as a city devoted to his patron, who at the time was the Emperor Augustus. Now, Caesarea, of course, named after Caesar, named after his patron, but it's built as a Roman city. It's built as a city that is Roman architecture, it's Roman styling, it's Roman culture. It's a way for the Roman authorities to be able to come to Judea, which is obviously a very traditional Jewish, it is the traditional Jewish country, and certainly Jerusalem is a Jewish city, but it's a place where the Romans can come and feel at home. It's a coastal city, so when you arrive in Judea, the first thing you see is this beautiful Roman city, this Caesarea, and when you go beyond that, you're going into Jewish lands, but you've at least got this Roman presence down there. So that becomes the capital, that's the seat of the governor, and so that region of Judea that's run by this Roman governor that's where he will stay on during his normal time in the place. But what we need to keep in mind is that Judea is only one small part of a larger province. So it's a sort of a sub-region that's looked after by the governor, but then north of that you've got Galilee, which is looked after by King Herod. You've got other places around that are looked after by different people, but all of it falls under a larger area, or a larger district or province of the Roman Empire called Cilicia. Now, Cilicia kind of encompasses all of what is modern-day Israel, Lebanon, all the way up into southern Turkey. So it's a very large area. If you sort of follow a map if you start from Jerusalem and work north and you go up and around to the west, up into southern Turkey, all of that was this area of Cilicia. And within that was Tarsus. So technically, Paul is part of this. He is from this larger region. He's not from Judea, so this isn't. So Felix actually doesn't have jurisdiction over Paul specifically, but he's part of the larger region. Now, Felix as well, what that means is that think about, he's looking after a state, whereas the president or the prime minister is overseeing the whole land. So if you imagine that Cilicia is a larger region which has an overall governor, what Felix is something like a sub-governor within within this larger region. So he himself has a boss, which is the point. Lysias's boss is Felix, and Felix himself has a boss above him, but Felix has the jurisdiction of Judea, and so it's his first responsibility to make sure that that's been ruled properly. And again, keep the peace, pay the taxes. That's his whole job description, and so that's what he's required to do. So this is obviously his prerogative to deal with Paul. It's not Lysias's. So all of this is well within, it's perfectly normal for the way that the Roman structure works within these regions. So anyway, Paul arrives there in Caesarea in about 57. So we're in about the year 57 by this point. And Paul's actually going to spend the next 2 years here, again, under house arrest, not because he's been imprisoned for 2 years for preaching the gospel, but only because they just don't know what to do with him. So he just ends up stuck here again because, well, they just don't know how to, they just don't know how to process this particular situation. So we pick up the story. It's Acts 23:34. It says, the governor, this is Felix, read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear your case when your accusers get here. Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. So Felix hears that Paul's actually from Tarsus, which is, again, within the purview. So it's actually under his boss's purview, but he's been arrested in Judea. And so in a sense, he's capable of, he's got some sort of authority to be able to deal with this himself. It's something that happened within his province, even though technically Paul is under the larger province of Cilicia, he can still at least do something with this particular case. And so he's saying, he's sort of realizing, all right, well, he's going to weigh it up effectively. He's got, he could send this issue back to his boss, but having read the letter, and this is the important thing, and I think think about why Luke actually puts the letter into his story, this is a formal document which just proves to any future readers Paul was innocent the whole time. This whole thing came about literally from a theological dispute. And so Felix is like, well, Felix can see straight away, at least based on this initial evidence, that Paul's innocent. This is something that he could probably just dismiss very easily, but he still needs to go through the formal procedures, hear from his accusers, get the full story. But if it is the case that this is just a misunderstanding, then it's very easy for him to dismiss this. And the last thing that he wants to do is to send this further up the chain to his boss. Lysias had to send it to Felix. He couldn't try the case. But Felix, if it is as innocuous as what it seems to be, to send this all the way up to the main governor, that's not good. That's not going to look good on him. That's going to seem like a guy who just doesn't have any sort of capacity to take any initiative whatsoever. I mean, it's kind of like you've got that person in any organization that is constantly coming back and just saying to the boss, what do I do next? What do I do next? Is this okay? Is this okay? And just never taking any initiative, never taking any sort of leadership role, and just going out and doing it and figuring it out for themselves. So you don't want to be that person. And so Felix is kind of like, well, all right, if it is what I think it is, then I can deal with this. But again, we need to do our due diligence, make sure we've heard from the accusers, make sure that it's all above board. And if that's the case, then we can just dismiss this and we can all get on with our lives. So the story goes on. Acts 24:1 says, 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus. They brought their charges against Paul before the governor. Now, what's interesting about this story is that the people who are coming down to make the accusations, it's the high priest and probably some of his cronies, probably some of the other senior priests of the Sanhedrin. So this is already being prosecuted by somebody who has no idea about what's actually going on. The actual crime, if you remember, was the couple of Asian Jews, the ones from Ephesus, who brought the charges that Paul had brought a Gentile into the temple. And yet, now, when we come to the trial, the people who are bringing the accusations are people that weren't even there, that had nothing to do with it. And really what they are the people that just vehemently hate Paul. They're the ones that just want him dead. They're the ones that really ultimately are the ones that have the bigger problem with Paul. So they're the ones that actually come down to Caesarea. It's not the people that are actually making the accusations or making the charges, which in and of itself is problematic because, well, how is this a proper trial if the judge isn't even hearing from the people who are making the charge in the first place. So they come down, the high priest comes down, which gives you a sense of how important it is that Paul gets done away with. The very high priest comes down to make these accusations. And they come with a lawyer by the name of Tertullus. Now, we don't know who this guy is, but most likely what we're dealing with is a local lawyer, somebody from the region of Caesarea, somebody they've hired locally to do the work for them, which would mean that Felix would probably be familiar with this lawyer. He's probably dealt with him before in previous cases. So this wouldn't be anything new for Felix. But for the Jews, they're going to go and get somebody who is a trained lawyer, somebody who knows what they're doing, somebody who can actually, prosecute this case to the best possible ability and hopefully bring about the outcome that they're seeking to get. And so we can see the skill of the guy straight away. Verse 2, it says, Tertullus presented his case before Felix, and this is to quote Tertullus. He says, "We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix. We acknowledge this with profound gratitude. But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly." Now, this is really good oratory. The thing with oratory is that you want to start strong. You want to start in a way that is going to draw out the best characteristics of your audience, right? You don't want to stand up and start a sermon, for example, and say, all right, scumbags, shut up and listen to what I'm about to say because I'm smarter than you. Like that, obviously no one would ever do that. And if you do, you're a total narcissist, but that would be a terrible, terrible, terrible way to start any sort of speech and certainly start any sort of sermon because, of course, nobody after that is going to listen to you if they're even going to sit in the room. Right? I'd be shocked if everybody just didn't get up and walk out. You don't start anything that way. What you want to do is to win over your audience. You want to draw out of them the best qualities of them and really highlight how good they are so that they're going to go, wow, this person knows me. This person is somebody who obviously is in touch with me or whatever else. At the very least, you're going to build a good rapport with your audience in doing that. And you're going to highlight qualities that are going to then be to the benefit of you for whatever it is that you're about to say. And so that's exactly what Tertullus does here. He starts off, he says, "We've enjoyed a long period of peace under you." Now, he could have said anything he wanted about Felix. He could have said that, you're a very wise man, or you're a great example of Romanness, or there's so many things, there's so many different ways that he could have flattered Felix. But what he starts with is that we've enjoyed a long period of peace under you. Now, what is that actually saying? Well, what that's saying is that he's really good at the keeping the peace thing. There's two prerogatives that you've got. Keep the peace, pay the taxes, go collect the taxes. You're really good at the keeping the peace thing. And he's already proven himself. If you remember the Egyptian insurrectionist that was put down and that Lysias thought he'd caught when he caught Paul, turns out it was Felix was the one who actually put that guy down, who actually dealt with that problem. That's what he's good at. In fact, he's got a bit of a reputation for being a very violent governor, for putting these things down very violently. So that's what he's good at. That's the thing that he's noted for. And so what they lead with is this very thing, draw out of him that characteristic that you're good at keeping the peace because, hey, what we're about to present to you is exhibit A of anti-Roman insurrectionist. This is the worst person on the planet. This is going to look so good for you when you put this guy down. And you're the very person to do that because the thing you're really good at is the whole keeping the peace. So that's a nice way to lead in to what they're about to actually accuse Paul of. And so he says, it goes on in verse 5, he says, "We've found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots amongst all the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect and even tried to desecrate the temple. So we seized him." Now, keep in mind, what has Paul actually been accused of? He's been accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple, which is in Jewish law punishable by death. And if you remember, the Romans allow the Jews to actually punish that particular violation. But that's not what they're talking about. When they do, they just talk about it as something at the very end of the charges. What's the first thing they talk about? They say that he's a troublemaker, literally a plague. He's somebody whose whole task in life is to go around and just cause trouble all over the Roman world. And notice they say this, he's stirring up riots amongst the Jews all over the entire world. Now, how do they know that? They don't know that. They can't prove that. That's just throwing out as much mud as you possibly can and just hoping that some of it sticks. But of course, they can't prove any of that. Now, the reality is that when you read through Acts, Paul has been involved in riots before. He was involved in one in Ephesus not that long ago. But if you remember too, he had nothing to do with that, right? That was a whole lot of other people rioting because they didn't like Paul. But Paul wasn't the one that started it. He wasn't even there. They had to hide Paul away so that he didn't get torn apart. And wherever there has been a riot around Paul, he hasn't been there. It's been people that have been trying to get to Paul. It certainly wasn't him that started it, and it certainly wasn't him that continued it. It was other people rioting because they hated the presence of Paul. So yes, there have been riots. None of them have been started by Paul. In every case, it's by somebody else. Those are the ones that should be punished. But this charge of saying that he's starting riots all over the Roman world, one, they can't prove it, and two, even if they could point to a few examples that we just mentioned, Paul had nothing to do with that. So he's not guilty of anything of what they're trying to say. But what is the job of the governor? Keep the peace. Well, what's the way that you keep the peace? You put down the insurrectionist, like this Egyptian insurrectionist that we had a couple of years ago. So they're trying to label Paul with the highest form of treason. That's because they know that if they can make that one stick, that's the one that's going to get him executed. And that's what the governor's prerogative is to do. So they're throwing this mud out. They cannot prove any of it, but nevertheless, let's just see if we can get away with this. Now then, to add to it, they say that he's the ringleader of the Nazarene sect. Now, what is that talking about? Well, what they're acknowledging is that this is a Jewish teacher. He's a teacher of Judaism in the same way that we are. He's a Jewish man, obviously. He used to be a Pharisee. If you look into his past, you'll see that this is an educated, honorable rabbi. He's done great things. You can't deny who Paul is. And so if they just let it sit there, then they'll say, well, the conclusion is, well, then he's just one of you, right? He's just another Jewish authority like you guys are. So how come you're not all guilty of the same thing? So they're trying to make a separation. Yes, he is like us, but at the same time, he's not us. He's something different. And so what they do is they characterize him as being a ringleader, okay? Not just any member, but the ringleader of this Nazarene sect. Now, what is that referring to? Well, the Nazarene sect, or the Nazarene, of course, refers to Jesus. Jesus was from Nazareth. And so what they've come to designate this in more of a sort of derogatory sort of way is that you're a sect of Judaism, but you're that Nazarene sect because you ultimately represent the great Nazarene, Jesus. And so Paul's part of that sect, and that would have been probably a term that Felix would be familiar with. I mean, he's literally in the heartland of Judaism. He obviously would have heard about Christians at that point, and he would have probably heard them being slandered by the Jews that he's dealing with, guys like this high priest. He would have heard about this Nazarene sect before. So they're drawing on something he's probably familiar with and going, we've caught the leader. Okay, these guys are troublemakers. They've always been troublemakers. You've seen the trouble they've caused. We've got the leader. Here he is right here. So what are you going to do about it? Now, one more thing to read between the lines here. Jesus is the Nazarene that they're referring to. What was Jesus killed for? Oh, that's right, insurrection. He was charged with insurrection. He was charged with forbidding people to pay the taxes and claiming himself to be a king, which is the two no-nos. He's saying don't pay the taxes. Well, that's the Romans' job, is to collect the taxes. And to claim to be a king is to be an insurrectionist. So he's the chief insurrectionist. Now, what happened to Jesus? Oh, that's right, he got crucified. Now we've got the ringleader, right? His lieutenant is here. So you can put an end to all of these troubles if you just deal with this guy. Now, technically, the ringleader of the Nazarene sect is James. It's not Paul, it's James. But there, of course, let's not quibble over these minor differences. Paul is the ringleader. He's the troublemaker. He's the one we want to get rid of. You've got him right here. Let's put this guy down. So again, more mud, none of it being true, but if you've got a governor who is very pragmatic and, a tendency towards violently putting down insurrectionists and can just get away with it anyway, well, hopefully maybe we can just play to that to that part of his character. You're really good at keeping the peace, and you do that through violence. Here's the most violent gang leader or insurrectionist leader in the land. He's right here. What are you going to do about it? All of that is just as much mud as possible. Hopefully some of it sticks, and if it does, we get our desired result, which is that Paul will be executed. And so then they bring in the actual charge. Oh, and by the way, he tried to desecrate the temple. But who really cares about that? Focus on the insurrection thing. Focus on the ringleader of the Nazarene sect. Focus on the guy who doesn't just start riots in Jerusalem, but starts them all over the Roman Empire. You're not just doing a favor for us here in Judea. You're doing a favor for the emperor, because here's a guy whose sole ambition is to go around and tear down the empire from the inside out. So here he is. What are you going to do about the situation? Now, just as an interesting little side note, if you look at in Bibles, generally in most cases what you're going to find is a footnote at this point, which has a different manuscript tradition. Now, what we find with the New Testament is that there are in some cases there's lots of manuscript traditions, and the Greek Bibles that we deal with are sort of the best version or the closest version of what would have been the original. But as translations happened, there would be other little traditions that are incorporated into various different versions throughout the world. And in some situations, they add a little bit of information which is of interest, but we can't be completely sure if they were part of the original. So we'll put them in a footnote instead, just to say, look, there's this other tradition that has emerged. It probably wasn't original, but it was at least seen to be valid by certain parts of the church back in the day. So we're going to put that in just kind of as an FYI, just as a point of interest. And so we get one of these examples here of this other manuscript tradition, which adds a little bit of extra detail to this testimony that the high priest is giving, or the Tertullus is giving. So what it talks about, so it says there, the original story in verse 6 finishes with them saying, "So we seized him." So we saw this terrible ringleader, this terrible insurrectionist. He was in town causing problems, so we seized him with the intention of him to bring him to trial. But then in this other manuscript tradition, we have this a little additional piece of information which says, "And we would have judged him in accordance with our law. But the commander Lysias came and took him from us with much violence, ordering his accusers to come before you." All right, now put yourself in Felix's position here. Paul has arrived on his doorstep. He's been brought up by maybe 200 Roman troops who've accompanied or have protected him on the way up to Caesarea, and he's come with a letter. There's a letter from Lysias saying, "We found this man. He's a Roman citizen, so I rescued him. And the best I could find out is that he has a disagreement over whether or not Jesus is alive, or just this theological dispute over the resurrection." That's the information that he's worked with to this point from his man back in Jerusalem. But now, what he's hearing from this high priest is that this man is an internationally renowned insurrectionist whose whole ambition in life is to tear down the Roman Empire, and he's the ringleader of the Nazarene sect. I mean, this insurrectionist group, his very mentor, his very exemplar, Jesus Christ, was the ultimate insurrectionist who the Romans actually crucified. And he's this absolutely horrendous man who's also desecrated the temple. So he doesn't just violate Roman law, he violates Jewish law as well. And this guy is the worst. And Felix was like, hang on, 5 minutes ago, it was just that he had a theological dispute with you. Now he's like the worst person on the planet, which is true. You cannot get any more extreme in the charges. That on the one hand, he's just a guy who's got a different idea about the resurrection. What a stupid thing to argue about. Now he's an enemy of the emperor himself. Which is it? It's like this is about as an extreme contradiction as you can possibly get. And Felix, who's probably not that smart to begin with, is like, this is not what I was expecting. This is very, very different to what I first heard. But now we add to this additional piece of information, if this was originally in the letter, which is that, well, it's not actually that the Jews were trying to kill him and that Lysias came and rescued him because he discovered that he's a Roman citizen, but in fact that the violence began when the Romans turned up. We were just having a peaceful conversation with Paul, maybe a bit of a heated argument, but we were trying to figure it ourselves, and we would have dealt with this. It was just a private matter. We would have happily dealt with this in the Sanhedrin, but your man Lysias came down and started beating people up. He came down with his swords and his men, and they were trying to tear the place apart and trying to kill us, and they were trying to exert their Roman authority, and it was all just a nightmare. We would have very peacefully done this if it wasn't for your man Lysias. Now, the story that Felix had heard 5 days ago is that Lysias came down and rescued him from these Jewish people. So which is it? I mean, you cannot get any more extreme in the accounts of what this guy has done. And in the middle of all of this is Paul just going, well, this is ridiculous. I mean, what a stupid situation that we find ourselves in. And also remembering too, Paul still has this trump card, which is, oh yeah, by the way, I can really throw your man Lysias under the bus because of what he was about to do to me. So it's a little bit of a nightmare of a situation for Felix, right? He's got to try to sort through all of this quagmire of information, completely contradictory information, to try to figure out, well, firstly, what on earth is going on, to then be able to determine, what do I do with this? Because on the one hand, this was a clear-cut case of an innocent man who's just, it's got a theological debate has got out of hand in the streets of Jerusalem, to now being, I've got public enemy number one to the emperor himself, and trying to figure out from these two extremes, one, which one is true, to then what am I actually going to do about this? This is a complete nightmare. But then just to finish off this, the charge or the testimony of Tertullus, he finishes by saying, verse 8, by examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all these charges we are bringing against him. So look, if you don't believe us, go and ask Paul. You'll see straight away what a terrible person this guy is. It's so clear-cut and obvious that this is the worst insurrectionist that Rome's ever seen that you'd be dumb not to see it. So it's just so obvious. Felix, you know what to do. You've got your man. This is going to be a great day for you to put down the ringleader of the Nazarene sect. What are you going to do about it, Felix? It's entirely up to you. So Felix, of course, is in a bind now. This is not what I was expecting. This is not what I'd first heard. And, well, the only person now who can hopefully bring some clarity to this situation is the very person who's been charged with all of these things in the first place. And so, of course, in any court case, we've had the prosecution that have brought their case. Now it's time for the defense to bring his case as to what is actually going on here. And so Paul is about to offer his response to all of these charges and hopefully clear his name. But as we're going to see, it doesn't work out that way. In fact, what this does is just further escalate the situation to the point where Paul spends the next 4 years under house arrest. But anyway, we'll pick up this next stage of the story, well, next week. We'll hear from Paul and what his defense actually is. But apart from that, thanks for listening. Have a really, really great week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. All the best.